Booker T. Washington over Mary McLeod Bethune, got to find out some things about Mary McLeod Bethune. A lot of people who thought that Mary McLeod Bethune certainly would be greater because of Booker T. Washington's, some of his philosophies, were able to see him in a different light. Some of the more controversial debates we had were over, was Bill Cosby being lynched or was he not being lynched? Some of them, we had one on Condoleezza Rice, who was greater, Condoleezza Rice or Fannie Lou Hamer. I think that every time somebody was certain as to what the answer was, they are more likely to learn something at that debate. So that's the whole purpose of it. You had the John Henry Clarke House, and this is a house that's dedicated to one of the greatest African historians in our lifetime, and a person who is made greater by the circumstances of his birth. He was born literally with his name on a plowshare in a system of slavery, still exists in America, called the sharecropping system that is tremendously stacked up against the sharecropper. It looks good. It's a form, I guess, of feudalism. It looks good on paper. A guy with a big farm, you'll have a little piece of the land and you'll grow a few crops, and at the end you'll share it all, and so on and so forth. But it always ends up in the end that you end up owing them, and that you're tied to that land, and that in fact you're tied to that land and your children are tied to that land. So this house is dedicated to John Henry Clarke because he went way beyond those borders, that little piece of real estate that was laid out for him, and he became an international person, and he affected us and improved us internationally in terms of the information that we had and the way that we were able to look at that information. So we're trying to continue in that tradition here at the John Henry Clarke House. This building was purchased by the Board for the Education of People of African Ancestry, I guess almost a couple of decades ago now. It was the brainchild of Dr. Adelaide Sanford. For Dr. Adelaide Sanford, another person we consider to be very, very great, you can have ideologies, you can have theories, and those things are great. But when you have people that are dying, that are literally dying for the lack of something, they really aren't that interested in your theories. Sister Adelaide took a school that was the lowest performing school in the district on the standardized tests, which were determining at that time, to a large extent, what was going to happen to you educationally. And she took that school from the lowest performing school in the district, it was my elementary school, by the way, to the highest performing in the state. And she eventually became a regent, and as many people say, most of us didn't even know what a regent did or what the Board of Regents was supposed to do. She brought that information back to our community. A sister of, in that status, you would never expect to see the inside of a jail, but she's seen the inside of a jail a few times. Once for laying down in front of tractors that were trying to build something that was against the interests of the community. Another time in the day of outrage, and another time when she was a child. But anyway, she can tell her own story when she's here sometime. Just want you to know you're in a historic building. We're very glad to have you here. I hope that everybody learns something here, and in keeping with the greatness, we have two great ones with us today. We have the great mathematician and historian who has given us Holocaust, African Holocaust for Beginners. We have Dr. William Sorrell, who he's written more books than I have thoughts, you know. And he's here with us today, and he's been debating on a number of subjects for us. He's been very good in donating his expertise to Clarke House, and we're very glad to have both of these great scholars here. Now, I'm kind of starting things a little bit backwards. We should always start in our tradition with a libation. And I'm going to call up one of our younger members. She's been in the movement all her life. Please welcome to the microphone, well, there's no microphone, please welcome to the lectern, Sister Lenora Sharp.
ask the elders for permission to speak.
You have permission?
Okay. We'd like to pour libation for the Mother, Father, Creator. Ashe.
Okay.
We'd like to pour libation for Dr. Clarke, the father of this house, and everything that he's done. We'd like to pour libation for Dr. Ben, who just left us recently. And now we'd like to pour libation for any of your ancestors. You can call them out now. Ashe. Ashe.
John Henderson.
Ashe.
Bill Dobson.
Ashe.
Malcolm
Ashe.
Nectar.
Ashe. Ashe.
Fannie Lou Hammer.
Ashe. Trayvon Martin. Ashe.
Nat Turner.
Ashe.
John
Ashe. And we'd like to pour libation for all the ancestors who we don't know their names, but we feel their spirit.
Ashe.
And for all the elders whose shoulders we stand on.
Ashe.
And for the future generations.
Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
I would like to call up the co-chair of the board for the Education of People of African Ancestry to welcome you properly, Nana Betty Dobson.
I want to welcome you to the Dr. John Henry Clarke House, where many things are taking place and have taken place in the past, and we expect that more will be so in the future. The Dr. John Henry Clarke House is headed by the Board for the Education of People of African Ancestry. So the board members are essentially advocates for teachers, students, principals, teachers, and that's the work that goes on here in an ongoing way. I have a few announcements that I'd like to make, and I think that you'd be very interested in them. We have an opportunity to go to Washington to a tour that's entitled Egypt on the Potomac. It's an African-centered field trip to Washington, D.C., and you discover the hidden secrets of the nation's capital on this specially designed field trip. It's a field trip that Louise Dente, who is sitting in the front, hosts, and she has done this annually. And it's an excellent trip. It's a round trip on a luxury motor coach, and there are discounts on meals and what have you. And they stop at the Great Black and Wax Museum. So if you're at all interested, and we hope that you are, we would ask that you see her, and she'll be able to tell you more specifically. You can come right in, sir. Come right in. Come on. Not there. That's my seat. Also, I hope I pronounce this right. Asala, is that correct?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Sorrell, this is one of the organizations that you are very much a part of. On April 4th, they're having Heritage and Hope, the African American Presence in United Methodism by Grant H. Shockley. And the leader will be Susie Hampton. We urge you to attend these wonderful discussions. They're held on Saturdays at the first Saturday at Hamilton Grange Library. That's at 503 West 145th Street, and it's from 1 to 3 p.m. And we also have flyers to give you more information about Asala. And how many, you have flyers to pass out, or you, she's passing them out? Okay, you just give them and let the people pass them out. So I made those two announcements, and I hope that you'll be able to attend at least both of them, to tell you the truth. I'll add to my welcome the fact that we often ask if there are individuals here that are here for the first time. If so, I'd like to see who you are by raising your hand. Any first-time visitors? One. Just one this time. Two. I certainly want to extend a welcome to you and thank you for coming. I hope that you signed in downstairs so that we can be in touch with you. And what we ask those that attend to do is to write legibly your email address, your name and your email address, and then that way we can be in touch with you. So having said that, again, I welcome you, and I know that you're in for a very enjoyable debate, discussion, information sharing situation. Thank you.
Okay, one more announcement and then we're down to business. Next week there will be no debate. It's a holiday. I had a debate that I wanted to schedule, but I was voted down by the other members of the board. So our next debate will be on the 12th. It's going to be on who was greater, Martin Delaney or Frederick Douglass. Some of you might not even know who Martin Delaney is. Some of you might not even know who Frederick Douglass is. If you're interested in finding out, come on the 12th of April, 3 p.m. right here. And our last debate in this series will be should black youth join the New York Police Department, New York City Police Department. So now, I hope to see you all again on the 12th. Now it's time for our debate. These are, I guess, the basic ground rules. Each debater will have a 20-minute presentation. You know, we don't go right to the minute, but at 20 minutes you start to see signs get held up for you, and then people start making noises and lights start blinking. No, that doesn't happen. Just in about 20 minutes we ask you to stop. And then after each gives a 20-minute presentation, we're going to have, they get a chance for a 10-minute summation and rebuttal. And then after that, there is a question and answer period of about 20 minutes in which both presenters stand at the lectern, and you can ask a question. They have the opportunity to answer any question. You can be as for or against any position as you like, but we want to keep it all cordial. We come in here as brothers and sisters, and we intend to leave here as brothers and sisters. Is that all right with everybody?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I'll let the debaters decide who wants to go first. Brother Sam or Brother William would like to go first. Okay. The question is, should black youth join the United States Armed Services? And representing the affirmative side is the great historian, Dr. William Sorrell.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm a historian, so I'd like to talk about history and speak in the affirmative for the youth joining the armed services. I'd like to talk about benefits, and not necessarily benefits for the individual, where one might get physical prowess or mental stamina or even income. I want to talk about how the military benefits us as a people in terms of either our freedom or our minds being liberated. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was the British governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation calling upon all white indentured servants and all enslaved Africans to come over to the British side in order to gain freedom. Now this is a shockwave. It shocked the hell out of give me liberty or death Patrick Henry, shocked the hell out of I can't tell a lie George Washington, and it shocked the hell out of all men are created equal Thomas Jefferson. And the reason it shocked the hell out of them because all three of them lost their property. They ran away. South Carolina had a 60% African population in 1770, and Virginia had a 40% African population. And the fear was those who ran away would be armed and would come back and kill their owners and free their families. And as a result, George Washington very, very reluctantly was forced to call for slaves and free Africans to join the American Army as a counter move. Now, our people, our ancestors, were not debating who is better, the Americans or the British. They were debating who's going to give us freedom. And so we had eventually 5,000 Africans, some enslaved and some who were not, fighting inside the American Revolution. When the war ended, the British took 1,800 people with them to Nova Scotia, and many of them ended up going to Sierra Leone. So the benefit of that war was that we gained freedom for some. But also because the war was about Americans calling for liberty from their own enslavers, the Crown and Parliament, we had people writing petitions. And there were several sent to Connecticut and Massachusetts, where ancestors said, "We are held in bondage while you yourselves fought to escape bondage. So why are we still in bondage?" That so moved Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, that she echoed that sentiment by saying, "Here we are fighting for our liberties, and we're holding others in slavery." As I move on, the Civil War that began in 1861 was a white man's war. I didn't say that. President Lincoln said it. It's a white man's war. And he said that when he turned down the request from abolitionists to enroll free black men. It wasn't until the summer of 1862 when Abraham Lincoln came to the conclusion, the only way I can win this war is by destroying slavery. And in a private letter to the military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln said, quote, "The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of Mississippi would end the rebellion at once." And with the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's only a one-page document, the key point was not freeing the slaves because he had no power to do so unless the military could come in and liberate them. The key point of the Emancipation Proclamation was the United States government would accept slaves and free men of color into the American Army and Navy. And this is the reason why Frederick Douglass in 1863 said, "Men of color to arms. Go over to Massachusetts." Now he said go to Massachusetts, not New York, because New York's governor, Horatio Seymour, was opposed to enlisting black men into the American military. It wasn't until you had a club called the Union League Club that bypassed the governor and went to the War Department and organized in New York State 3 regiments, the 20th, the 26th, and 31st United States Colored Infantry, which was the subject of my doctoral dissertation in a book. And so we had 179,000 men of color fighting in the American military. They weren't fighting to preserve the Union, not necessarily, that was secondary. They were fighting to allow themselves to remain free because most of these men were runaway slaves, and runaway slaves who were captured in the battlefield were executed or sent further down south to be re-enslaved. They were fighting to free their families. And this is the reason, by the time that the war ends in 1865, Frederick Douglass said, "If you give a man a blue uniform and shiny brass buttons, this man wants more than just being a soldier. He wants his freedoms, he wants complete freedoms, he wants the right to vote." And this is why we had this agitation called Reconstruction that went on from 1865 to 1877, in which African American men were active participants in governments in the South, in the former Confederate states. What's essential about all these wars is that it caused a eruption in the psyche of people, and particularly when black men are fighting against white men like they were in the Civil War and later on in World Wars I and II. White people are not invincible. If you're taught in a psychological way that he is so superior, then you fear and then you're quite reluctant to rebel. And so when black soldiers in Civil War in 166 regiments saw that their bullets could kill white men, there was jubilation. There was a freedom, a psychological freedom. And this continues. And during the Spanish-American War in 1898, very short war, is called a splendid little war. It only lasted 4 months. And the main thing that we gained from that, because we had what were called the colored regulars, 24th, 25th, United States Colored Infantry, 9th and 10th Cavalries, and then later on there were volunteer regiments from different states. we went to Puerto Rico and Cuba to fight against the Spaniards. And there we saw other men of color. And we were able to make comparisons about our mutual conditions. And by making these comparisons, it led to sort of a budding form of Pan-Africanism. We saw how they were treated, and we told them how we were treated. And we had an awakening because in 1900, after the United States defeated the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay in the Philippines, President McKinley had a choice. And the choice was allow the Filipinos to be self-governing, which he said no, they can't. Allow them to go back to the Spaniards, says no, we can't. So he came up with a conclusion. He said, quote, it's our Christian duty to civilize and Christianize our little brown brothers. So we have American soldiers in the Philippines fighting a war that hardly anybody ever heard of, a war against Filipino people, and we had men of color who had to fight because that's their duty as soldiers, and yet they saw Filipinos who would come up to them and put hands next to their hands and say, same color. Why are you fighting us? Why don't you fight those who lynched your people and raped your mothers? And so these men wrote letters. There's a book called Smoke Yankees. That was the name that the Spaniards gave these men. And Smoke Yankees by Willard Gatewood has letters sent to the African American press, in which the men would write about their experiences in the military. And many of them said, we would like to desert, but it might bring shame upon those who are left back home. But what it did, it internationalized the situation and made these soldiers very much aware of who they were at that time. And this carries forth down to the First World War, which starts in 1914 in Europe, but not American involvement until April of 1917. And again, we have the colored regulars, and we have others who are volunteers into the military, even though the military didn't want us to be in combat. See, there's a great fear of the black man with a weapon in his hand. Didn't want them in combat. So the French said, we welcome you. So the French gave these men in the 369th, gave them uniforms, gave them weapons, and then gave them gratitude and praise for what they did. And what they did was save France from being destroyed by the Germans. And so these men receive acknowledgments and receive honors. They came home to a country that was against them. And we have in 1919 what's called the Red Summer. But there was a difference. And the difference was these men who came home had seen combat. They had seen Germans on the battlefields crying for their mothers. They had saw those who were supposedly invincible, no longer so. And so they came home, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, we return fighting. So in 1919 there were race riots, but we fought back. We fought back in such a way that an unidentified woman from somewhere in the South wrote a letter to the Crisis magazine, edited by Du Bois, in which she said, when I heard that black men in Washington fought back, I jumped on my bed and I was beating the pillows, half in crying, half in sheer joy, because at last our men had fought back. And that was an important thing. And what also was important, because of the internationalization again, there were Africans from French-speaking countries, from French-speaking Caribbean, and Africans from the British colonies, and they met the brothers from America and began to exchange ideas. So it's, again, budding Pan-Africanism. When Garvey came here in 1916, Garvey was part of what became known as the New Negro movement that was stirred because the men who had fought had a much wider horizon of the world and events. And we have in 1919, Cyril Briggs started the African Blood Brotherhood, a movement that was short-lived. But again, it's awareness. It's awareness that came out of their military service. And then in World War II, everybody know about the Tuskegee Airmen. How many know about the double V? Raise your hand. Double V? The double V was a effort to say this war is more than just America defeating the Nazis and the Japanese. This war is about liberating us from American tyranny. And so the Double V campaign started, and everything was Double V. Double V dance, Double V beauty contest, anything you think of was named Double V. V for victory against the enemy, and V for victory against the oppressors here in America. And the point here I want to make is that these soldiers, again, being overseas and seeing war at close hand and seeing that they have power that white people didn't have, and seeing that when they return home, they no longer let white people have that kind of power. So it's not coincidental that someone like Medgar Evers, who had military service, came home and is leading the fight to bring equality, the struggle against discrimination. It's not surprising that some of the men down south in the 60s who were known as the Deacons for Defense, you heard about them?
Yes.
The Deacons for Defense, men who would have their weapons and they would protect civil rights workers. See, when you had a situation in Anniston, Alabama in 1961 with the Freedom Riders, where their bus got firebombed and these riders who were peaceful were tear gas and choking and went to the nearby hospital, and the hospital would not let them come in, and a white mob came to do harm, and a bunch of preachers came out of their cars with their weapons. And some of these preachers were, again, military veterans. And so my point is that even though I'm sure Mr. Anderson, Dr. Anderson is going to have a lot to say against me, and if y'all want, I'm ready for the witness protection program. But I think that the main thing I'd like to conclude with is, and I'll have more to say in the rebuttal, is that by being in the military, it gave us a much wider exposure, and one that we would never have if we were not in the military. Because once you go in the military, not only do you learn self-discipline, you learn what is the world like and what it's like to be out there. And I cannot stress hard enough that someone who was raised to bow down to the god of whiteness and to see a white person in the battlefield scared and crying for their mothers, and to come home and then see that same white face trying to dominate them, there's no way that they would not resist.
That's why they call it a debate, you know. Yeah. I think you know, but now I see Sam over there and he's cool, but I see him write little things down, so I know he's coming over here to do some damage. Please welcome to the microphone Dr. Sam Anderson.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Clarke House. Thank you, Brother Sorrell, for giving us some pieces of our history. I reluctantly hooked up with this discussion, this debate, because I think it's framed awkwardly. What I think we should look at in historically is the evolution of the black soldier from that period of 1775 to the present, because it's as Brother Sorrell pointed out, it's a complex development, evolution of a black soldier. You had, as he stated, thousands of brothers joining or wanting to join with the American, the newly minted American revolutionaries, with the promise of being free. At the same time, you had thousands of brothers and sisters who wanted to join with the British with the promise of being free. So those dilemmas resolve themselves, if you will, with the victory of the white American revolutionaries who wanted to hold on to slavery. And that was the fundamental purpose of the American Revolution. The transformative moment in the development of capitalism was the making of America as a slave state. And we got subjected into that and got woven into, reluctantly in many cases, the fabric of this society as enslaved African people with a handful of free blacks, quote unquote. Gigantic quotes around that. With that, we know that there was this dilemma brewing among us in this country post 1799 to 1802, i.e. the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution had a direct impact on African people inside the United States. Inspirational impact. They saw that African people can fight and be victorious over the largest, most powerful military in the world, the French. And that was an inspiration. And I think that added into, some decades later, into those brothers and sisters who wanted to join in with the forces against the South during the Civil War. That they had this understanding, many of them had this understanding, that their primary purpose was to free our people, not necessarily to bring about quote unquote democracy as was talked about by white folks in the North, but to free our people. And as Brother Cyril pointed out, Frederick Douglass and others, went out and recruited folk to join, and we joined by the thousands, and we were some of the fiercest fighters in the Civil War. Why? Because we were fighting for our freedom, first and foremost, to free our people. And so that was an important component. But at the same time, initially, right, Brother Cyril, the American Army recruited black soldiers and had them go without pay. They weren't going to pay black folk. All right? They weren't going to give them a gun. Okay? So we had a fight on that. And that kind of institutionalized racist construct was embedded in the U.S. military from that point onward. So that we see coming about after the Civil War, the use of black soldiers to eliminate the remains of Native Americans in the United States, i.e. the Buffalo Soldiers. And the contradiction that raised within the soldiers themselves and within black folk across this country debating whether or not black people should be in the U.S. military. And the Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental in making sure the white man's manifest destiny was a real deal. And so they went across the country, eliminating Native Americans, executing them in the name of democracy and manifest destiny. And as Brother Cyril pointed out, that from 1865 onward, in terms of the military, the Buffalo Soldiers in the 1870s, 1880s, and they wound up the second phase besides Mexico, besides fighting the Mexicans for their territory, which we commonly call Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. That was all Mexico. Okay? Right. Besides doing that, they went to the Philippines, as he pointed out. They went to the Philippines to fight the quote-unquote Spanish-American War. The furthest west of manifest destiny. Not only the Philippines, but also to Hawaii, obviously. And it is there they saw black people. It is there that many of those soldiers saw black people, saw the conditions that they were facing under white rule as they were facing horrendous conditions within the military themselves. And it culminated in the Philippines with thousands of black soldiers leaving the army. Some joined the revolutionary forces. One became what is known as the general. And some of the first disinformation reports in Western media came out in this period. The general, he was a militarily trained brother fighting for the Philippines, for their freedom, for their independence. And he was the most sought after, quote unquote, deserter of the U.S. military. And so the New York Times did a disinformation thing. They couldn't get him, right? So they did a disinformation. On the front page of the New York Times, they had a white soldier holding up a beheaded black person's head, right? Saying that we got the general. And it was a negrito. It was one of the black Filipinos' head. It was not the general, because several years later, in World War II in the Philippine Islands, one of the islands, the indigenous people brought the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers, over to this old black man who was the general, right? He was there. He survived. So it was proof. All I'm saying on that is that, yes, that the positive things that came out of being in the military was the whole aspect of self-discipline and knowing your weaponry. But as time went on, the evolution of the black soldier became more questionable. And during World War I, as it was pointed out, of course, the white army here did not allow black people to fight alongside them, so they had to fight with the French. That created a sense of militancy and so forth. Fast forwarding through World War II and the segregated army in World War II and all of the horrendous things that happened with the segregated army in World War II, my father was initially a Tuskegee Airman that he wound up being in the artillery, because it's a long story. It's what we call New York City arrogance that got him into the artillery. But there were contradictions abound within the segregated army of World War II and just a little bit after it. The Korean War also. The Korean War was the first imperial war by the U.S. that had an integrated army, quote unquote, integrated army, fighting quote unquote communism. And black soldiers suffered tremendous suffering even in the segregated army. I remember my father talking about how he got frostbitten, because even though the army was quote unquote integrated, the black soldiers did not get the military supplies that the white soldiers got. We come to the key turning point in all of this is the Vietnam War. I think the Vietnam War is a culmination in black people's historical understanding of the deep hypocrisy of the military and of the hypocrisy of this country as being one that fights for democracy but is really an imperial racist power. And in the Vietnam War, we had resistance to the draft that was beginning to be organized. Malcolm talked about it, the Vietnam War in 1964, speaking out against it, and it impacted young brothers and sisters in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, by 1965 in the South, SNCC was organizing an anti-draft movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an anti-draft movement in the South, particularly in Alabama and in Mississippi. And by January of 1966, John Lewis, the then head of the of SNCC, released a public statement declaring SNCC's opposition to the military draft and U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, linking the recent murder of SNCC activist Sam Young to that of peasants in Vietnam. And by April '67, Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, declared that the draft was nothing more than, quote, white people sending black people to make war on yellow people in order to defend the land they stole from red people. Cannot be any more clear than that. Okay, and that was the sentiment that began to spread throughout the South, the North, and the West among young black people. You know, and one of the slogans is "No Vietnamese ever called me a nigger." You know, and in that same period, we have Muhammad Ali, champion, heavyweight boxer of the world, resisting, saying, "No, I will not be drafted." And that was a major, major psychological breakthrough for young black people. Because here's a brother who could be a millionaire, at that point, that was a lot of money in those days, right, or a multimillionaire, give up all of that for a principle, And later, in 1968, we formed the National Anti-War, Anti-Draft, the National National Black Anti-War, Anti-Draft Union. And the purpose of that was to have an organized national effort to inform young black people not to be drafted, to resist the draft. And that was headed up by Sister Gwen Patton, who was a leader within SNCC. And to wind up saying that from that point on with the wars of the United States, the imperial wars of the United States, the effort to create AFRICOM in Africa, all of those wars are wars against people of color. All those wars, or plans of wars of people against people of color. On top of that, the tremendous development of messed up minds, the post-traumatic syndrome being created in these wars all over the world. And our brothers and sisters coming back jacked up, messed up, really messed up. Much more so when we look at some of the records of the psychological impact of the wars in the Civil War or even World War I. It didn't have the tremendous widespread negative impact mentally on our brothers and sisters. And these wars are wars that I stand with those who say no to the draft then, and no to black people going into the military now, unless the only reason why black people should go into the military today is if we had an organized revolutionary force that would be able to have brothers and sisters infiltrate the military for their own purposes, for that organization's purpose. Other than that, we should be struggling for jobs for our young people, jobs that are not military, jobs that are based in the community, jobs that help the economic development of black people wherever we are. That is the position we should have today. That we should work very hard to make sure that when our children are being tempted to go into the military, that we work to not have them go into the military. I have done that in my family as much as possible, and I think to a certain degree success, I think we should do that. We should not allow one more black person in the U.S. military to fight imperial wars that will be mainly on people of color on the planet. Thank you.
Did they do a good job, y'all? Give them a round of applause. That's why they call it a debate. And it's going to get better because when they get to that rebuttal and that summation and rebuttal, I think it's going to get better. Now I have to make a request. I couldn't localize where it was coming from, but somebody was doing a little hum the entire time that brother was speaking. If it was you, please stop. Very, very disturbing to the process here. So you might have been doing it unconsciously, but please don't do it anymore. Okay. We've developed a little tradition here. We have our resident poet, and he comes up and does a cultural production at this time. I don't know if he's ready, but I have a suspicion he is. He has a little smile on his face. Please welcome Brother D. Nubian.
I do need to make a correction of something I said 3 weeks ago. If y'all were here, I did the poem on the dollar bill by the last poets,
Right.
E pluribus unum. I incorrectly attributed that to Suleiman al-Hadi, the late Suleiman. And it's actually Alafia Boudin who did that poem. I'm about to do one of Suleiman's right now, appropriately titled The Black Soldier. Let me get my cheat sheet out since I don't exactly have that committed to memory. I'm gonna do about half of that poem. Here's to you, black soldier, in some far-off distant land, helping your oppressor oppress another man. Here's to you who volunteer your precious lives to give, while we here in the ghetto are struggling to live. It is a sin for you to be upon some foreign shore, while you are needed. Sorry. Here's to you, black soldier, in some far-off distant land. Sometimes it does arise the question, which side do you stand? To know the use of weaponry, I must admit, that's good. There is an occupation force in our neighborhood. We hope and pray that you've been spared when casualties are high. We demonstrate for your return, and we mourn you when you die. We've watched you grow up from a child. We know your strength and might. It is no news for us to hear how gallantly you fight. To know the use of weaponry, I must admit that's good. There is an occupation force in our neighborhood. They call themselves peace officers and law enforcement groups. And from the acts that they commit, we know that they are troops. The government is cracking down with its oppressive hand. They have the dream of stamping out resistance in the land. But our determination grows and widens with the days. We'll fight them from the rooftops and from the alleyways. We'll fall upon them in the night and put them to the blade. We'll free the prisoners from the jails in calculated raids. There is but one desire, our bonds and chains to bust. We only wish that with your skills, that you were here with us.
Very appropriate poem. Okay, brothers and sisters, I'm going. Come on, you can come right through. Right up this side. Okay, I'm just gonna show you. At this point, I'm going to ask that everybody be generous and donate to John Henry Clarke House. I don't think I have to do a big presentation about that. I think that most people know that the gas and electric cost lights, the water cost money, the gas and electric cost money. and that the flyers cost money and internet service costs money, and of course, we want to preserve John Henry Clarke House. If you don't want it to get swept up like so many of the things that you see in our neighborhood now under the so-called process of gentrification, we just ask that you be generous. I don't want you to give us your rent money, I don't want you to give us your food money, but I want you to make a sacrifice and give up any money that you might be saving for cigarettes or for anything else that might be harmful to you. And if all you have for us is a good wish, we appreciate that. Whatever you give, we appreciate. I just ask that you would come up and shake my hand and drop it in the basket. Anyone who wants to make a contribution. Thank you, good brother. Thank you. Get worse, he said. So no point worrying. He told me something else. He said, then it's going to stop. He said, until it stops, you're ahead of the game, okay? So at this point, we're going to call up Dr. William Sorrell for his 10-minute summation of results.
Okay, I'm not going to dispute what Brother Anderson said, because I'm a historian and what he said was valid, was correct. What I'd like to talk about in my rebuttal is something else. Currently, African American enlistment in the Army is around 20% of the total, and for the Navy and the Air Force, 17%, and Marines, 10%. As far as officers are concerned, the percentage in the Navy and the Air Force and Marines is around 5 to 7%, and in the Army around 10 to 15%. My argument is we need to have these numbers much higher. By having higher numbers, I think we get better treatment. Because a lot of brothers got court-martialed during the Vietnam War because they had black power symbols, or their hair was too big. In contrast, white soldiers walk around with racist symbols and not get court-martialed. But by the way, if anybody has any family or friends who are military related and having problems, there's an organization in Brooklyn called Black Vets for Social Justice, and they help vets who have needs for housing and jobs and so forth. They're located on Willoughby Avenue. I interviewed some of them several months ago, and I learned a lot about what kind of services they do provide for vets. My concern is this. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, going back about 10 years ago, the recruitment was very low because people didn't want to go and then go and then go and go and go 4 and 5 and 6 times, which led to this post-traumatic stress. And so the military had to reduce its requirements for enlistment. And who did they enlist? A lot of white racists. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, civil rights group in Montgomery, Alabama, there are currently 142 neo-Nazi groups in America. There are 119 racist skinheads groups in America, and 72 various Ku Klux Klan groups. And some of their members are going into the military because they're preparing for a race war. And some of them are stealing weapons, and some of them are selling weapons, and they're having militias training in the woods in North Carolina and elsewhere. And so my concern is, where do we stand in this matter? Now, Garvey asked 100 years ago, where's the black man's government? Well, governments have armies. And my suggestion is, have our army here. Get into the military, rise in ranks, become the officers, and as long as we have the right consciousness, ideology, things will be better for the soldiers and how they are treated. And I recall what Claude McKay wrote in 1919, because in that period called the Red Summer, 1919, Du Bois, who had written the editorial in the crisis saying close ranks. In the military terms, close ranks means come close together. And he said that we should put aside our grievances against the United States and close ranks and support the government in time of war. He said because he's looking for a military commission. And he was, attacked, criticized by a lot of activists at that time. So in 1919, when these men came home and there was bloodshed in the streets in Washington, D.C., and Springfield, Illinois, and Chicago, and elsewhere, Du Bois wrote an editorial called We Return Fighting, because he said, quote, America wants us to be dogs, monkeys, and whores. But we went over to bleeding France to save France, so now we come home, we're going to fight. And as a result, Claude McKay wrote a very famous piece, If We Must Die. I'll just read part of it. If we must die, let us not be like a hog's hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. We'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Now, 1,000 to 1 is crazy odds. And if we had more military experience, then the odds would be more even. And if we did this, and again, as Brother Anderson suggested, infiltration, because the racist skinheads, the Ku Klux Klan, the neo-Nazis are infiltrating the military. And they're gathering the military skills because they want to take over us. Because the more you read on the internet, all the anti-Obama stuff, Obama just represents us in terms of their eyes, and what they want to do to him, they would do to us. So my suggestion is, if we get people, again, have to have the consciousness, I suggest in the upcoming presidential election, a year from now, there'll be a lot of articles about Latino vote and African American vote for the Democratic Party. My suggestion is we need to go to the Democratic candidate and make certain demands in advance. If you want our vote, this is what we want in return. One, we want to be the cabinet officer in charge of the Department of Defense. And we want to be Secretary of the Army, just to start. By taking over those positions, again, with the right consciousness, we can do a lot to alleviate some of the problems that our brothers and sisters are facing currently, and also in the past, in the military. For example, in terms of, broaden our scope here, Michelle Howard is an admiral in the Navy, 4-star rank, first African American woman to achieve such a rank. If we could get more people across the board, Air Force, Army, Marines, Navy, in positions of high authority, but again, with the consciousness to reach out and to do the correct thing, then I say yes, join the Army, join the Marines, join the Navy, join the Air Force. And by doing this, I think we'll be in a better position, and we'll have the opportunities to really be leaders. Because too often, and everybody here probably has some relative who served in the military in some time in conflicts, and probably have horror stories about how they were mistreated because of their color. So I say take it over.
I'll call up now Dr. Sam Anderson.
Okay, the only way that you will have high-ranking black officers be revolutionary is within your own revolutionary army. to become a high-ranking black officer in the United States Army, you have to be vetted. You have to go by that, you have to jump through white defined hoops. Colin Powell comes into mind. Okay? Colin Powell was vetted in Vietnam. Colin Powell was an officer in the military whose primary objective in Vietnam was to tell the lies to the media. So he covered the My Lai massacre and a number of other massacres. He did his covered up, right? Covered up, yeah. So he did his job well, and he was promoted, and he became part of the decision-making processes within the U.S. military, in the Imperial Army, if you will. There are many, many historical records of black people rising up in the ranks, just as black people and being part of the problem. It is highly improbable, therefore, that in the U.S. military today and tomorrow and next week and next year, that we will be able to have high-ranking, revolutionary conscious folk in the positions of military power in the U.S. government. That's out. What is possible, however, is that as we develop our revolutionary organization, if we assume that the only way for us to really be true and free is to have a revolution in this country, is to be part of the revolutionary vanguard, if you will, is if we're true to that, then we find other ways of building up military prowess within our people, military capabilities. And so, in some cases, for example, I know some brothers and sisters who went overseas and got training. Okay, they're doing that, and that's being done now with the Islamic fundamentalists. They go overseas, they go somewhere, and they get their training. We have that capability, but in order to do that, you have to have a sophisticated organization. We don't have that in 2015. We barely have something slightly to the left of the NAACP. We have a lot of work to do to build up the organization that allows or requires the development of revolutionary military force. I think that we were closer to that development in the 1960s and 70s than we are now. And the issue that we face today is once Obama leaves office and we're no longer Obama-ized, we're back to face on white America and its two parties of the same vulture, same wing of the same vulture. And the issue is, how are we going to move forward given that reality? How are we going to move forward in a country that is now, as Brother Cyril pointed out, more racist filled than before Obama. More white supremacist organizations active, right? And not only that, you also have the active forces within the active racist forces within the Democratic Party itself. Don't even mention the Republican Party. And so the question is, for us today, I think we have to still work on making sure our young brothers and sisters do not go into the military. For all of the reasons I mentioned before, the psychological stuff, the being part of the imperial machine and what have you. That what we have to do is to find ways of finding alternative jobs for our young brothers and sisters not to be in that military, and to think that this military can come up with that we could come up with individual black people in the military who are going to be on our side at high levels is a pipe dream.